Here once again is our core language where we have numbers, plus and times, identifiers, bindings of identifiers for functions, function calls, and if zero. So all of these things we know are relatively fundamental. I mean, we could get rid of the numbers and plus and times and if zero, but then we would have to encode numbers. So it's pretty reasonable to include them in our core language. We've also been using let often. Let we know is just sugar for lambda. And it's easy to rearrange these pieces in a let form to have a lambda and an application form, and we have been implementing it that way. We could also add the add one form as sugar. So add one, which takes an expression that produces a number and just adds one to it. That is a very simple kind of sugar on plus. In fact, if a program needed add one, they could just locally bind add one, given that we have a let, to a function that takes a number and adds one to it, and then use add one in the body there. So there's certain kinds of things that we don't need to add as extensions to the language, like add one, because programmers can define those things themselves. But there's other things like let that it seems like we have to build into the language right now. Some other kinds of sugar that we might have to build into the language if we really wanted it. Minus could almost be a function. The only thing is if it's a function and we only have single argument functions, then you would have to put an extra pair of curly braces around things here. So this again is a simple kind of sugar. Maybe a programmer would be happy enough just using a minus form that's curried, as we can write as function. The case form, on the other hand, case would be a lot harder to write out. So if we wanted a case form like we were using in our compiled interpreter, where the expression evaluates to a number and then we dispatch to the appropriate case to evaluate the resulting expression, maybe there's always an else at the end, you can implement this with nested if zeros, but it's so much easier to read this way and so much clearer that this is the kind of sugar that you're likely to feel is worthwhile to add in at some layer. On the other hand, there are many things like this, so which one should we actually put in a language if we have to build them in? Or another example that we saw earlier in the semester, thunk and force. If you've got functions, these can be viewed as, again, fairly thin wrappers on functions because thunk just wraps expression with a lambda and a dummy argument, and force calls that lambda with a dummy zero or something like that. Depending on your language, you could wrap up the functions to make them distinct from regular functions. But in any case, it's not an elaborate kind of sugar, and whether it's worthwhile depends a lot on your program. If you're using thunks to delay and force frequently, then maybe it is worthwhile adding these things in. So we have this spectrum of things that we might want to add as sugar, and the only kinds of things that programmers currently can add to the language themselves are things that look like functions.